There's so many politicians trying hard to find the way and peace is not so far, and yet it seems that nobody can see that. Love is all that you need. Love is all what you have to do, yeah. Love is really the answer. Why waste time with the war?
I really believe that Hancock County has something to, I think we have something to teach the world. And that is how former slave holders and former enslaved people can really live together. How do you have a community where there's a predominance of African Americans, and yet the white citizens feel a part of the community, they are welcomed, and they're not fearful that they're in the minority? If you're always in the majority, it's very hard to understand what it's like when you see no reflection of who you are in a positive way. For white people who want to have that experience, this would be a place to have that experience that says, I can appreciate your history, and I want to understand what oppression, past, present, and unless we do something, future oppression means, not just for my life, but for your life. We're all harmed by oppression in any way. It's a matter of accepting that we're all in some ways keeping this system in place by the actions that we take on a daily basis.
Hello, sweet friends. Welcome back to Unbroken Chain. I'm Mara James, and that is Jeanette Waddell. I met Jeanette this summer while I've been living on a farm in very rural Georgia in the middle of Hancock County. The farm, which is owned by friends of mine, is about 300 years old, which is why it's called 3 Centuries Farm. And it's actually not even in a town, it's in an area called Devereaux Community, but the nearest town is Sparta, which has about 1,500 people in it. It's quite small. And I met Jeanette while I was helping teach at an inaugural program called 3 Cent Studio, where we had 5 urban art students come out for 6 weeks and do a couple projects in collaboration with the community and bring their energy and curiosity into an area that can often be underserved and overlooked. And Jeanette was an incredible force of collaboration. She lives in Hancock County. She grew up there, as you'll hear, and returned as an adult. And my 2 film students, I had 2 documentary film students who came out from Spelman to make a series of short films about the community, and she really helped plug them in with people and just made us feel so at home across the boards. This area, including the farm that I have been living on, is deeply formed by slavery. The area now is what might be called impoverished, but it actually used to be the cotton capital of the South. It was incredibly prosperous, and that is, of course, because it was built on the free labor of slaves. And I had an incredible conversation with Jeanette. She was just so generous and open, talking with me about that legacy and what it means now to build community given that history. And once we start to listen, I think it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly where our attention and energy needs to go to correct some really deep patterns of oppression that we just cannot afford to let continue a moment longer. I am completely humbled by the way in which people that I've met all over this country as I've been traveling, including Jeanette, people who have come from a lineage of harm and oppression, people that are experiencing it day to day in micro or macro aggressions in their lives, are coming to community building, reconciliation, and healing with such grace that they offer tools that we are so hungry for as a species. I'm just so humbled by people like Jeanette that have a vision for coming together, rebuilding in ways where everyone is included. And not just for a particular community that has been the target of a particular kind of oppression, which I would completely understand. I would not begrudge a community that has suffered at the hands of the system the way that Black people have in this country, closing ranks and saying absolutely no more contact, but that is just not what's happening here. There's a greater understanding of the pain and dysfunction of a society that perpetuates the kind of horrors that this country has, and a desire to correct that for all of us. And oh my God, is that the greatest kind of mercy? It's so clear to me that is the only way forward. And I have seen a lot of the tools, the perspectives, the mindsets, the practices that I think are going to take us somewhere better, that will help whatever percentage of us is going to survive this massive transition that we are in as a species to evolve, have come from a lot of communities that don't look like me, and that historically and even today might have very different life experience than me. And to be invited into that and these keys to our survival is such a gift. And I don't take it lightly that I came into Hancock County as a white woman that's lived in the North and before that in the Pacific Northwest with very little personal experience of what it's like to be a Southerner, and certainly not a Black Southerner. To be welcomed was a really powerful lesson for me as a storyteller in my power to uplift and honor experiences that are different from mine. And I'm so fascinated by that. I'm so in love with humans for that very reason. And I am so grateful to Jeanette, who has really devoted her life to this kind of transformative storytelling. And she's in really good company with people like Octavia Butler, I think, who are really truth tellers and prophets. And I have so much love and devotion for those spirits in our world. We need them so much. So here's Jeanette with a really beautiful offering about her life experience in this part of the world and her vision for where it might be headed in the future. Here she is, Jeanette Waddell, in a conversation in a general store, which is full of papers and milk bottles and plows from a generation ago in Hancock County, Georgia.
My name is Jeanette Waddell. I live in Hancock County. That's where I grew up and moved back. After graduating from high school, I moved around a little bit and finally, about maybe 30 years ago, ended up in Atlanta and thought I would be there the rest of my life. And that didn't happen, and I'm really glad it didn't. As my mother aged, we all wanted her to stay in her home as long as possible. And my work was very flexible. I could do it anywhere. I'm a professional storyteller, and I work from my home. And so it just made sense that I would be the one to move. And so I moved back to my hometown and became reacquainted with it after a long absence. I left as I graduated high school and came back to visit, but really didn't interact with many people outside of my family. So in a sense, the community was new to me, and I was also new to it.
What did you find here?
Well, I went back to the church that I grew up in as a child, and it really felt like I had never left. I just felt accepted. I felt they're loved, and just really became involved with working with the ladies in the kitchen, which I absolutely loved it. To me, that really was the heart of the church. That was Christianity, being able to encourage people and to feed people. And I really learned so much from them about hospitality. My idea was that we needed to be efficient, and we needed to move people through this line as quickly as possible. And that was not what we did. We greeted people. We asked what would they like. We asked about their family and their children. And the only person who really wanted to be efficient was me. And so I learned that hospitality isn't so much about being efficient. It is about caring for people and let them know that they are cared for. It's just a lesson that I will never forget.
I'm curious, what are some of the differences that you've perceived between sort of urban and rural life? Because I think there's a lot of conversation right now about the perceived differences and really how we're all people.
I think I can best explain that with a story. I always took my mom to the bank. I did most of the drive. She wasn't driving anymore, so I did all the driving. And she always liked to go through the window so she could actually see and talk to the person. That's not really efficient when, I could go through the other lane, but no, she insists on going to the window. So we went to the bank one day and we cashed a check, and I didn't count my change when I didn't count the money that I'd received from the person at the window. And so I drove through the window, and then I counted it, and we were $100 short. I'm thinking, we're just going to lose that money. So we went back through the window, and I explained what had happened to the teller. She reached in her drawer, pulled out a $100 bill, and gave it to us. And we drove away. Like, that would not have happened in the city. That would not have happened. I also know that when older people would go through, like the grocery store or something, whatever they need, if they need help with their ATM card or if they need anything, that cashier is there to serve them. And the other people in the line aren't anxious. They're not tapping their feet and sucking their teeth and making sounds like, just move on. We want to. No, there's this acceptance that she needs help. This person needs a little bit more time. And we're just happy and comfortable to give it to her. So life really is a lot slower. And people take time to care for and about each other, which doesn't always happen in the city. I don't think it's that people in the city are less caring. It's that they simply have more demands on their life. Whereas living in a small town, there are fewer demands, and you are able to take time. When I first moved back, there were certain things I needed to do. I needed to get a car registered. I needed to register to vote. I wanted to get a library card. And there's probably at least one other thing on that list. And I was able to do that in like 45 minutes. 45 minutes, and I gotten all of that taken care of. In Atlanta, that would have taken me at least 2 or 3 full days to be able to get that done. So there are some advantages to living in a small town.
I've noticed my attention to detail is much greater out here, I think because of that slower pace. I feel like there's much more coming in, many more signals coming in.
Well, I think there's a lot more natural stimuli. So we are surrounded by trees. We're not all surrounded by just asphalt and brick buildings. We're going to see a variety of undisturbed nature. It's not curated. It's just organic. And I think there's something about that that's very appealing to us spiritually, that we can connect to something that is natural, the way it has grown, not how we have arranged it. It would be really, really difficult for me to live someplace where the only tree was one that, somebody put there. I really do like having the grass and seeing deer and, all of these things. When I moved into the apartment that I lived in East Point, I'm driving down this long road, and it's this huge open field. I mean, it's just really nicely manicured, but it's just an open field. And there are trees and grass and everything all around it. And I look over into a corner where there's some woods, and there's a deer family there. And so I just felt like that was my signal to say, this could be home. This is a place that can be home.
What was it like to grow up here?
It was safe and very nurturing. You know, Hancock County is a really large county. Few people, but a lot of space. Your nearest neighbor might be a mile away or a half mile away. So there is very rare that you're going to find people really living right next to each other, especially at the time that, that I grew up in the county. You know, we played with all the kids in the neighborhood almost every day. We had a softball game that we played because at one time we had cows, but we didn't have the cows anymore. So we had a really big open pasture that was just ideal for playing softball. And so and I'm saying they might walk a mile to get to our house. And, we'd play 2 or 3 hours of softball and pretty much did that every day, especially during the summertime. But I have really fond memories of growing up in Hancock County. I went to college in the Midwest, and we were studying rural America, and was the first time I really realized that we were considered a community in poverty. I mean, it never occurred to me that would not have been a description that I would ever have had. And I think when you are only reading about the statistics of a place, you're getting a minimum amount of information. It's being in a place and being with the people and seeing what it is they do have that gives you a sense of the richness of growing up in a small community. You know, my mom had a huge garden, and practically everything we ate came from her garden. You know, my dad did a lot of hunting, so we ate deer and rabbit and squirrel and, all kinds of wildlife. And, that was life. You know, my mom got up every morning and, she made biscuits and grits and scrambled eggs. I don't remember having cold cereal as a child. And most of the bread that we ate was bread that my mother made, either biscuits or cornbread. And a treat was to have light bread, which was a colonial, white fluff. But that was a treat. And while you're living that way, you don't necessarily appreciate it, but really moving away, I could appreciate it. I remember my first semester at school, and nothing had flavor to me. I mean, there was no taste, chicken or anything, nothing, because I ate chickens that my mom raised. All of the vegetables I ate were ones that came fresh from her garden. And so that was really quite an adjustment. Tomatoes in a plastic, in the styrofoam. I just walk out to the garden and you take a salt shaker with you and you get this perfectly ripe tomato and you could just stand there and eat it. Or, growing so many watermelons that you could just walk through the watermelon patch. Of course, my mother didn't like that. We walk through the watermelon patch, burst one open, and just eat the center. Just eat the best part, just eat the heart. Because there were so many around, or, fresh eggs. So that was the life, and I've come to appreciate those memories now that I'm older.
When you describe it that way, it seems like the factory farmed chicken and the styrofoam tomato is that is a kind of poverty.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Were you aware of sort of the larger social politics that were happening in the country at the time?
Yes and no. Hancock County is unique in that it is largely African American. So my childhood, I grew up surrounded by other African Americans. The authority figures, while they didn't hold political office at that particular time when I was a young child, my interacting with the authority figures were very rare. And so, parents, like all parents, want to protect their children. And to the extent that they could, they wanted to protect us from the racism that was in the larger community. So we rarely went to Sparta or Milledgeville. There were African-American owned stores in our community, smaller stores, but that's basically where we did most of our shopping. All of my teachers were African-American. I really didn't have a white teacher until I was a senior in high school, and that was a a counselor. I can't say that I grew up actually knowing any other white child. My church was all black, so it wasn't a closed community, but it was a very protective community. So I didn't have to witness the whites only, and I have glimpses of that, the doctor's office and places like that. But again, those things were rare. So while on the one hand, yes, we did understand, and we had our own revolution here in Hancock County, where there was a political change from white leadership to complete African American leadership. We were aware that we got the cast-off books, whereas the few white students had a modern high school. Most African Americans were still going to church schools. The first elementary school and high school for African American students was built like in the 60s.
What is church school?
Where you have a building that's either in your church, the school is either in the church building or it's a building next to the church. That is the school. So there were many community schools that black students went to. And of course, they either walked or their parents took them. And most times the students are walking because a lot of black people didn't have cars. When the high school that my siblings went to, Ellis Ingram High School, a group of black men in the community bought a school bus so that they could take the students to school, whereas the white students did have a school bus paid for by the county.
I have a sense that some of the, let's say, unrest that's happening in the country right now is in part because we've never really dealt with the legacy of racism and the fact that this country is built on slavery. I wonder if you have any perspective from this county particularly where that history is present, of how do we hold that reality but also heal and transform it.
I think I have spent, the first part of my life was spent in, I would say, 99.9% African-American community. Well, when I went to college, I went to a Catholic school in the Midwest in a town where there were no African-Americans, in Indiana, which that's part of where the Ku Klux Klan started.
Wow.
And of the, let's say, 1,200 students, maybe there were 60 African-American students. So it was a completely different environment. And I had intentionally chosen a religious institution because I felt there would be less of the racism. And that's probably true, but it certainly was still there. My freshman year, I had a history professor who felt that it was appropriate to refer to enslaved African Americans with the N-word. And reporting him to the administration, and their response was, "There's nothing that we can do." And there were other incidents, but that's really the one that stands out. And in spite of that, I had 4 good years at St. Joe's. I enjoyed my college experience. What I didn't have was any sense of belonging there, and I really envy my classmates that went to historically black colleges and universities, because as alumni, they go back to their homecoming games, they financially support it, they wear their T-shirts and their hats, and there's this sense of belonging that I never had at St. Joe's. I mean, once I left, I had no real desire to go back.
Mm-hmm. So for this county, when you're here, is there a sense of history in this place?
Somebody has said that you can't kick over a rock in Hancock County without there being some history. There's a lot of history. At one time, Hancock County was really one of the most prosperous counties in this part of the country, not just in Hancock County. And that's part of our story. And I think that is where we have not experienced healing, because there's a sense of, let's tell part of the story. Well, that is part of the story. The other part of that story is that wealth was built on enslavement. Mm-hmm. And we can't really move forward until there is some honesty about our past. 4th of July is tomorrow. Well, my ancestors were not part of that. In fact, they were intentionally left out of that part of the Constitution. And yes, I'll be going to a celebration. It's a family reunion, but I'm not celebrating the 4th of July because I don't have anything there to celebrate. I suppose I could celebrate in a sense of aspiration, that perhaps at some time in the future, perhaps for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, it might be different. My great-grandfather was born enslaved, and he was able to vote. But by the time my grandmother was 18 or 21, she no longer had the right to vote.
Wow.
And it's this repeated cycle. If you read about Reconstruction and the black institutions that were started during Reconstruction, black men and women were elected to their local legislatures. They became senators. They started banks. I mean, the progress was just amazing. And all of that came to a screeching halt as soon as the federal troops left, and there was a rise of the KKK and a resentment of African American achievement.
So what does real healing look like so that we stop these recursive cycles?
I think it really begins with an honest look at our country and making sure that our history books reflect the whole story of America. Not maybe a year or so ago, I think it was in Texas, where they were just completely leaving enslavement out. They were servants, indentured servants. And there's just a complete rewriting of history as opposed to really looking at what South Africa has done with their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what was done in Germany, where rather than having statues and glorifying the Nazis, their pavers are the names of the victims, those that were victimized by the Nazi regime. What has happened in this country is that we glorify the oppressors. And that's the story that's being told. The idea that the Civil War had nothing to do with enslavement, that it's states' rights. Okay, I might give you that. However, what the states wanted was to continue owning my ancestors. And so until we can honestly deal with that part of our history, but see, the history of the country doesn't just start there. It starts with what happened with the Native Americans. It starts with what happened to the Arawaks when Christopher Columbus came to the New World. The idea that he discovered America. Mm-hmm. So, there is all of that. And I think without that, without understanding that, without acknowledging that, without blame, and without guilt, but also without shame. Because for a long time, slavery was a shameful part of African American history. And
what do you mean?
That somehow we participated in our own victimization, that we cooperated with it, that we were basically children and unable to manage ourselves as adults and unable to manage our own freedom. And so when you hear that long enough, it seeps into who you are. When you live in a society and the only images you see of yourself, I mean, currently, if you watch TV, the image you see of black men most often on the news is that they're in orange jumpsuits and they're being arrested for something, or it's a mugshot. As if, I guess, white men don't commit crimes.
Did I see, I was in downtown Sparta the other day. Is that the little square in the middle of downtown? Is that a Confederate monument?
It's a Confederate monument. And there's been an attempt to make it a war memorial. But there is no hiding that that is a Confederate monument in the heart of an African American community.
Yeah, yeah. Well, where are you looking to, I guess, better stories or the stories that need to be told? Where do you see connection and inspiration happening?
Well, I think you. I think young people. Children certainly don't have those things. You know, there's no color consciousness in very, very young child. It's something that we teach them. And I do think that with opportunities now for young people to get to know people from different ethnic backgrounds, different socioeconomic areas, different regions of the country, it's different when I read about who you are and when I know who you are, when I have a chance to see you, talk to you, understand your heart, and we can come to a place where we can talk without blame or with the expectation that somehow you can fix it. So as we're having this conversation, I'm not expecting a fix from you. What I am hoping is that through this conversation, there will be some awareness that maybe the world isn't what you see on the news or what you're reading about in your newspaper. And maybe people who don't have the education or don't have the economics are intelligent, they can manage their own funds, they are adults, they do know what they want in their life, and that they're doing everything they possibly can to have the best possible life for themselves and for their children, that they want the same things I want and that you want. Mm-hmm. You know, they want opportunities. They want a safe place to live. They want their children to have a more than what they've had. And I'm not necessarily talking about the McMansions and the, 8, 9 figure salaries, but I'm saying simply a good quality of life. They want to contribute to their communities.
Mm-hmm. Are there resources that are needed in this area in order to facilitate that?
Oh, absolutely. And practically everyone that you can think of. There's very little industry, so that property taxes is really where our local and county government receive their funding, which means our property taxes are high. Healthcare, there isn't a local hospital. So people are having to go 25, 30 miles to Milledgeville or, Macon, sometimes to Atlanta for their basic health care. The whole county basically is in a food desert. We have one grocery store.
For the county?
For the county.
Wow.
One place that you can get fresh vegetables. Now, there was a time when most people had gardens and things like that, and still a lot of people do, but it's not always feasible when both parents are working to a job. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So all of those things, and yet with all of those things, there still is a richness here. There is just a beauty here. There is a welcoming here that is very refreshing. Mm-hmm. What you see physically, particularly in downtown, it's not who we are. Mm-hmm. And yes, we all know what downtown looked like. And Doug Jones, he's one of our local artists, but he just took a plot of ground and he planted some beautiful flowers there. Mm-hmm. So you see people attempting to make effort. People are making an effort to improve the environment that they're in. And while that might not mean a lot to, someone driving through, they would completely ignore that. For those of us living here, that's something that's very hopeful to us. So rather than being depressed about what we see, we can be excited about that beautiful patch of flowers that he planted. And that's what we can focus on until we can do something different with our downtown.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What is your vision for the area?
Well, I really believe that Hancock County has something to, I think we have something to teach the world. Mm-hmm. And that is how former slave holders and former enslaved people can really live together? How do you have a community where there's a predominance of African Americans, and yet the white citizens feel a part of the community, they are welcomed, and they're not fearful that they're in the minority? If you're always in the majority, it's very hard to understand what it's like when you see no reflection of who you are in a positive way. For white people who want to have that experience, this would be a place to have that experience, not in a negative way, but in a very positive way that says, I can appreciate your history, and I want to understand what oppression, past, present, and unless we do something, future oppression means, not just for my life, but for your life. We're all harmed by oppression in any way. Everyone is harmed by that. And for the majority to understand that until my life expectancy is the same as yours, until the opportunities my grandchildren will have in education is the same as yours, until we can come to that place, we'll always have these struggles going on. And that is a place we can get to. It's not an impossibility. It's a matter of will. It's a matter of accepting that we're all, in some ways, keeping this system in place by the actions that we take on a daily basis. I had a white gentleman tell me not too long ago, he said, I went through Walmart and they checked my receipt. And I said, is that the first time? He said, yeah. I said, well, I don't think I've ever been in Walmart when they didn't check my receipt. And that's just a simple thing. That's not a big thing. But that's the world that I inhabit. And until you understand that world that I inhabit, you're powerless to do anything about it. So acknowledging that piece of history and saying, well, why is it that this person has never had their receipt checked? And I practically always have my receipt checked. What is that dynamic? Why is it that we're only seeing black men and women really murdered by the police and not being held accountable for it? Why is that dynamic going on? Why are young black men and women going from school to jail? And why are they being suspended 2 or 3 times at the rate of white students? Why is the mortality rate for African American babies 2 or 3 times the rate of white children? Why are African American teenagers drowning 7 to 8 times the rate of white teenagers? What are those things rooted in? And what do we need to do to make sure that we are now erasing those differences? Because we've identified what the differences are. I mean, we don't have to do any more research. You know, there is data out of the yin-yang of the imbalances. What's missing is a desire of people, because I don't think this is going to come from our political leadership. This is going to have to be something that community by community chooses to say, this is the data for our local community. Now, we're going to take some steps. We can't do this overnight, but we're going to have a plan, and we're going to have some benchmarks. And over time, this is where we're going.
Wow, yeah. I had a conversation the other day with somebody about Twitter, and they were saying that, they were having, this was a black woman, and she was saying she was having a hard time with all the videos of the police violence that she felt like she was being exposed to and re-traumatized. And I said, that makes sense to me. As a white woman, I can say that there are a lot of people that I know that need to see those videos because they need to see that it's going on. So where is that? Because it shouldn't just be the job of the black community to educate white people all the time. So how, as a white person, do I step into that without asking you to bear that burden doubly?
Well, I think what you're doing, begin to read media that, there's still African American newspapers. I mean, something like Jet and Ebony, African American Essence magazine, Black Enterprise magazines. There's websites, there's data. All of this information is available on the web. So asking that question, why am I only seeing this? What's the real reason for this? And doing your own research. But I think it really all comes down to looking at who's in my circle. If all of my friends look like me, then I really have a one-dimensional view of the world. Am I intentionally and consciously getting to know other people, and they then become part of my circle, my friendship, so that I know what's going on in their life, that we are open enough with each other. And when I hear this story, I'm going to suspend my disbelief. I'm going to believe what I'm being told. I'm going to believe that the person telling their story can interpret their life experience. And I will accept what they are telling me about their life experience.
Wow, I like that a lot. Are you seeing in Hancock County, are there forums where it's possible for that cross-pollination to happen?
Well, we've done several things. We started with a community picnic, probably, I think this may be our 9th or 10th year, and that was our intent. The first year, people ate and they left. And this last year, I was really ready for people to go home because I'm tired. We've been here since 8 o'clock in the morning. But it was just really wonderful to see people linger and interact with each other in a way that they'd never done before. So that was really great. We do a cleanup on MLK Day, and the same thing. We're intentionally wanting to invite a good mixed group of people to come on this day of service and to participate in it. So we really intentionally are looking for opportunities to bring people together in the same space. And as we get more comfortable with each other, I'm not intending to take anything from you. My intention is not to be harmful to you. My intention is not to blame you for the past. But can we start today getting to know each other? And then as you know me and we come to care for each other, there's an incentive for you to want to look at why my life doesn't mirror your life, even though we may be in the same economic bracket, we may have the same education, work-wise, we may be in the same level, but why is it that the outcomes for my life are drastically different than yours?
I become accountable for you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Have there been teachers or experiences in your life specifically that have taught you about how to kind of hold space for this?
Well, it really started with St. Joe's, and then after I left St. Joe's, my first husband was in the military, so we moved to North Carolina, which, again, was very similar to St. Joe's. And then I worked for an insurance company, and out of 100 salespeople, there were 2 African Americans and 1 Hispanic woman. Wow. And when asked why there were so few African-American salespeople, the response was, well, we don't know where to find them. And I was thinking, okay, there's Spelman, there's Morehouse, there's Howard. So that, to me, is an excuse. That is an excuse.
So you've just been on a path of kind of exposing yourself to life.
I think so. The church that I belong to in Atlanta started out, its founding was an interracial church. And so by the time I got there, maybe African Americans were maybe 10 or 15% of the congregation. But yet there was no reflection of my spiritual heritage. There were not songs that I was familiar with. The issues that were important to my life were not part of the sermons. So basically, it was, again, a white church that black people came to. And I watched this revolving door. Black people would come, and they were so excited for the first 2 or 3 weeks. And then 2 months later, they're gone because they realize this does not reflect me. I have a spiritual heritage that I'm really proud of, that I want to maintain, and can't we combine the two? Can I hear a song that I'm familiar with every once in a while? Mm-hmm. Can we address an issue that is important to me, that really affects my life? And I just watch that, just that revolving door. And then the more African Americans that came to the church, the more white people that left. And so I think now it's probably primarily African American. So what I learned from that is just really how difficult that process is, and how intentional we have to be about it. And yes, it is messy, it is uncomfortable, there are going to be misunderstandings, feelings are going to be hurt, but ideally, we know that we all have good intentions, that we are meaning this to be good. And yes, I didn't do that quite right, or I said that wrong, and I'm sorry, and can we talk about it and help me understand where I'm misunderstanding, where am I making assumptions, where is my historical information inaccurate? And now let's go about correcting all of that together, together. And let's have fun together. We got to have fun. Let's not forget the social and social change. We got to laugh together, cry together, be with the birth of a child and the celebration of the birth, but, also be there at someone's death and celebrating their life.
I hear the storyteller in you there.
Oh, okay.
That's beautiful. Yeah. What are your intentions as a storyteller? What kind of stories do you try to tell?
Always ones that will be inspiring and uplifting. There's always hope. And that's the beauty of a story, is that, a story, much of it is I can imagine the world I want. And I can bring that into my story. No, that's not the world we're in now, but that is the world that I hope for. And I can begin to paint that picture for people through the stories that I tell.
Man, I'm so grateful for that. And I've been thinking about that a lot as we it feels like we're in this very intense time of transition, and there's a lot possible for what we're moving towards. And we need good stories to have something to aim to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I am really excited by just the democratic feel. I mean, that looks like America. I remember looking at our gymnastics team with Gabby Douglas, and I don't remember who else, but there was an African American, it was white, there was Hispanic. I mean, that team looked like America, and they were so successful.
Yeah.
They absolutely just nailed it. But I think it was the diversity in that team. They each brought their own historic and ethnic strength to it, and together they were so much more than any of them would have been individually. But I know that most of that field will probably drop out, but that's what we're aiming for in every sphere of American life, that our leadership looks like who we are.
Well, I wonder if you have any advice or wisdom for people that are maybe feeling hopeless or aren't sure how to create good stories.
When I am at that place, I go back to that generation of enslaved Africans who not one person alive lived on the African continent, that they had lost that personal live experience of living free. And there was nothing on the horizon to even suggest that freedom was a possibility. And yet, somehow, in some way, they held on to the idea of freedom. In every way possible, they fought for it. And they passed that hope on to their children. My mother had a 5th grade education. And how did she inspire her children? How did she? And somehow she did. We all grew up. We left home. Most of us, all of us, have owned homes, except one sister who chose not to. But we have cars, and we lived a much more prosperous life than my mother ever dreamed of. Most of us graduated from high school. I have 2 sisters that are beauticians. I'm a college graduate. So somehow, in the midst of all the poverty and all the other things that were going on around us, somehow she found a way to communicate that our lives would be different and our lives would be better. And I think we have to go back and find that in our own personal history and say, well, how did they do it? And I know they did it because I'm here. I'm here, I'm a witness to it. And to bring those stories forward, and then that becomes a part of our inspiration. If my mother in those circumstances, she was widowed twice. She was widowed the first time when she had 6 children and her youngest child was like 2 years old. And then 3 years later, she remarried my dad, and they had 3 more children together.
Wow.
And so, here is someone, and when she was widowed the second time, her house burned in 1 week, and my dad died in the next week, or it might have been vice versa. But I mean, the trauma of, losing your husband for 20 plus years and everything that you own.
What did she do?
Well, she had purchased land, and she had insurance, so we got a mobile home for her, and she went to live with her daughters in Detroit. And then eventually she was tired of being a prisoner in the city, practically, and so she came home.
Wow.
I am just so inspired by that. She always gave us hope that there is a better life ahead of you. And she equipped us to know that, one, you have to work hard for it. And she gave us those work skills. You must be disciplined. And she gave us that discipline. Learn all that you can. And she taught us to do that.
It sounds like you have a very present relationship with your ancestors.
That's really a good way of putting it. I do, and part of the reason I'm so attached to the physical land of Hancock County is that I know that all over this county, my ancestors' blood is in the soil. Not just their blood, but also their labor and their sweat, their skills. One of the things that's really unknown about the African slave trade is that they chose men that had already learned the trade from their fathers. So these were not people who came ignorant and untrained. They were farmers, they were iron workers, carpenters, cloth makers. These were the skills. And there was an intentional raiding of villages where the skills that they needed in this country were present.
Wow.
So when they wanted people to grow cotton, they went to the cotton growing region of the African continent. When they wanted people to grow rice, they went to where they grew the rice. When they wanted indigo, they went to where they grew indigo. So the people that came here were the best and the brightest. And think of the Middle Passage as a purging, because anyone that wasn't physically or mentally strong did not make it. So the Africans that were enslaved, that they were the best humanity had to offer in every way possible.
What a legacy.
It is a tremendous legacy, and I don't take that lightly. And so I want to see their hopes and their dreams realized in this place, in this community. I want to redeem their investment.
What do you mean?
Because they invested everything that they had here, and they received nothing from it. And many, many generations of African Americans have yet to receive the full investment that was made. And I want to see this community prosper. I won't live to see it, but I know that my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and I'm speaking figuratively, they don't have to literally be mine. But those future generations will live in prosperity in this place.
It's a beautiful vision. Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you before you go, what does freedom mean to you?
Oh, That is just such a big question. Such a big question. I think it's the ability to tell my story and for it to be heard and respected, to be self-determining. Kwanzaa is an African-American holiday that starts December 26th and goes through the first of the year. And self-determination is one of their 7 principles of Kwanzaa. And self-determination is one of those. Collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, faith and creativity are all of those principles. And so I think when we collectively think about those things, that's really what freedom would look like to me. But not just for me. Mm-hmm. I want that for everybody. Because if everyone doesn't have it, I'm really not free.
Well, thank you.
Well, I've really enjoyed it, and this was completely different than what we had planned. So it's been a pleasure. And, we can always do it again.
Yeah. If people want to connect with you, is there a way that they could find you on the internet?
It's I'm on Facebook, Jeanette Waddell, and that's probably the best place to go to my Facebook page, Jeanette Waddell.
Okay. Thank you, Jeanette.
It's been a pleasure.
Love is all what you needed. Love is all what you have to do, yeah. Love is really the answer. Why waste time with you are?
Thank you so much for joining us again today. I'm so grateful for all of you spending your time and energy listening to these stories and sharing your thoughts and feedback. If you want to connect further, you can find me also on the internet at marajames.com and on Instagram at marajames. If you're someone that doesn't experience macroaggressions on a daily basis, I just want to encourage you to take Jeanette's advice and continue educating yourself. Talk to people, more importantly, listen to people, and use the resources that we do have at hand in this magical age of 2019 to access the human library of wisdom that is our greatest resource. I mean, we can basically time travel through generations of experience and wisdom, accessing information from generations before us in ways that we haven't always been able to. I think ancient wisdom used to help us do that in many magical ways that we've lost the knowledge of for the large part today. But the internet is a mycelial network of wisdom that can, yes, be a tool of distraction and numbing, and it can also be super empowering. And I encourage you to be thoughtful about the ways that you use it, and at least some percentage of your time to try to engage with it in a fruitful way that can help broaden your compassion. I'm trying to do that in my own life and catch myself when I'm abusing it. And if you're someone that experiences macroaggressions, I see you. You are not alone. You're not alone. And I thank you for sharing it in the ways that you are able and that you're safe to do, because I know that we all benefit from learning from those experiences. We need to do more to honor your stories and uplift them and believe them. And I thank you for being who you are, and I honor you. I pray that the tools for healing that are expanding outside of the institutions that claim to be the be-all end-all for our healing and education continue to become more and more accessible, and I ask all of us to continue to fight to make them universal and available so that everyone, particularly those who have immediate healing necessary in this lifetime, to be nourished and supported. Please share what is working for you. Share your medicines, share your songs, share your poems. We don't have to ask for permission to heal ourselves and to heal one another. And that is our greatest obligation to each other as brothers and sisters in the human experience. Thank you for the work that you're doing out there. Thank you for caring. Thank you for continuing to play and seek joy and create things, even under challenging circumstances. I'm so grateful to be part of your world in a small way, and I look forward to spending time with you again soon.
Fundamental, necessary, and love in your life. Oh, the people living together, yeah. It's gonna be like 4th of July. Let's have a ball tonight. Fundamental, necessary, and love in your life. Oh, the people living